In December 2014, the indigenous settlement of Monte Salvato underwent an emergency airlift evacuation. The event was triggered when over 200 armed members of the isolated Mashco Piro emerged from the deep forest. This unprecedented appearance was the result of a structural anomaly in the forest geometry, measured by the Spatial Canopy Fragmentation Index, or CFI. This outlines the CFI equation, calculating canopy disruption by measuring the ratio of disturbed edge area to unbroken core area. The baseline metric is definitive. When CFI greater than 12.0%, nomadic movement patterns shift from circular seasonal foraging loops to erratic, linear defensive retreats. To understand the collapse of these territories, we must audit the structural mechanics of spatial compression within the Madre de Dios basin. This maps the spatial proximity threshold metric, or DPROX, which calculates the physical distance between isolated populations and encroaching infrastructure. When DPROX falls to 3.5 kilometers or less, it triggers immediate territorial defense, tactical camp relocations, or violent intergroup friction. Applying these metrics to the Upper Los Piedras catchment reveals the scale of the recent territorial breach. Sentinel-2 and Landsat 8 multi-spectral monitoring identifies over 45 kilometers of illegal logging access roads constructed deep into the Upper Los Piedras catchment, directly dissecting core forest canopy corridors. The biophysical isolation of the Mashco Piro has transitioned from gradual erosion to a non-linear structural collapse driven by synergistic extraction. This collapse extends to the specific topography of the Madre de Dios river network. Alluvial gold mining drives the physical destruction of the riverian ecosystems that nomadic groups depend on for survival. Miners use high-pressure water cannons to dismantle and wash away entire sequences of ancient alluvial terraces. This hydraulic extraction process permanently strips the structural integrity of the riverbank, converting stable geology into raw sediment sludge. The environmental cost is quantified by the 185 tons of mercury released into the environment every year. This chart tracks the hydrological fallout, recording an average suspended sediment concentration exceeding 1,500 milligrams per liter in the Colorado River tributary. That sediment load forces the tributary to shift from a stable channel into a highly braided, geomorphologically unstable configuration. The final stage is a total loss of river floodplain connectivity, resulting in stagnant, discolored sediment ponds. The methanogenic anaerobic conditions in these ponds accelerate the production of methylmercury and the proliferation of zoonotic disease vectors. By severing aquatic food chains, mining forces isolated bands out of traditional riverine sites and into logging-dense interfluvial ridges. To combat this, the Peruvian government launched Operation Mercury in February 2019, deploying military forces to clear the La Pampa region. This chart tracks the immediate outcome. Following Operation Mercury, mining decreased by 70% to 90%. Furthermore, excavated mining pits in illegal mining areas decreased by up to 5% per year. However, clearing La Pampa created a spatial paradox. Displaced miners migrated north, using the interoceanic highway as a conduit to enter legal mining concessions. This displacement triggered a rapid spike in activity within areas directly adjacent to the protected corridor. This area chart visualizes the spillover. Deforestation in legal mining areas north of the interoceanic highway at a rate of 3 to 5 square kilometers per year. The intensity of this new clearing completely offset the revegetation progress achieved in the Tambopata buffer zones. The intervention failed to address high global gold prices, which remain the underlying economic driver of the industry. Command and control operations operate on flawed spatial assumptions, displacing rather than eliminating illicit extraction, and pushing conflict directly into legally unprotected nomadic corridors. Within these corridors, commercial timber operations exert a separate physical pressure on isolated populations. Unpaved timber arterial roads reconfigure the forest floor light spectrum, creating severe microclimatic barriers. This thermal gradient shows that localized temperatures increase by up to 4.2 degrees Celsius along road edges. This microclimatic shift acts as a physical wall, obstructing the migration of the megafauna that isolated bands hunt for survival. Landsat data tracking isolated indigenous group viability over time reveals the demographic consequences of this environmental compression. The data isolates a single example of a relatively large and growing population, consisting of roughly 400 people, whereas all of the other 7 groups exhibited much smaller villages and gardens with no sizable growth through time. Resource scarcity forces these bands into a dangerous dependence on iron machetes and axes scavenged from the logging camps encroaching on their land. Infrastructural encroachment forces biological and demographic decay on isolated groups long before any direct human contact occurs. Monitoring these corridors relies on satellite data that contains severe sensory blind spots during the equatorial rainy season. Between December and March, persistent heavy cloud cover blinds optical satellite sensors, rendering systems like Landsat and Sentinel-2 incapable of monitoring ground-level clearing. Even synthetic aperture radar has limitations. While it penetrates clouds, its waves reflect off the multi-layered forest canopy, hiding sub-canopy understory clearing. Illegal logging operations exploit this 4-month optical blind spot to construct spur roads without detection. When uncontacted bands scout these unmonitored camps for metal tools, they encounter the threat of abandoned artifact transmission. Respiratory pathogens like influenza A and SARS-CoV-2 jump between populations via fomite transmission, surviving on abandoned clothing and plastic containers long after loggers have left. Overlapping land use guarantees silent, unmonitored epidemic events deep inside primary forest interiors without a single physical encounter taking place. The destruction of the Mashco Piro corridor is fueled by a cartographic conflict engineered by the state. The government guarantees international protections for isolated peoples on paper, while state allocation mechanics lease the exact same geography to extraction companies. This conflict is defined by the boundaries of the Reserva Territorial Madre de Dios and its proposed expansion. This map identifies the core failure. 130,000 hectares of commercial timberland directly overlap the proposed protection expansion. Global certifications validate these operations, creating a paradox of sustainable greenwashing. The FSC maintains certification despite satellite data proving these concessions overlap active Mashco Piro foraging zones. When the fragmentation index breaches 14.2%, spatial compression maxes out entirely. With nowhere left to retreat inside Peru, Mashco Piro bands are forced across an unmonitored international boundary void into Acre, Brazil. Caught between conflicting legal frameworks in 2 different nations, the Mashco Piro are left in a protection vacuum. The state framework acts as an inescapable cartographic trap.